April 2011. I was 18 years sober in AA. I was married to a wonderful woman. We've been married for about 11 years. I was a very proud father of a great 6-year-old son. I'd run a successful nonprofit. I had just won some national awards and been on some public TV commercials and stuff like that. And at 5 in the morning in April 2011, there was a bang on the door and the FBI raided our home. And I was subsequently indicted for possession of child pornography.
You're listening to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast, a place for sex addicts to share their experiences of recovery to help break the stigma, myths, and misconceptions of sex addiction. This podcast may contain topics of sexuality, sexual trauma, dysfunction, or other things that may be triggering, so listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. My name is Jason, I'm a sex addict, and I am your podcast host. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 190 of the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. For this episode, I'm happy to be sharing a conversation that I had with Josef N. Back in February, Josef sent in an email asking to be a guest on the podcast. I forget which episode I read that on, but I was really eager to schedule him as a guest. Josef and I met at the Los Altos meeting, as well as the San Francisco meetings, and his email really intrigued me. In it, he mentioned being sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and has been out since July of 2016, and he really wanted to share about his incarceration. More on that in a moment. I don't know if you can tell by the sound of my voice, I have been trying to record this for about a week and have been down with a pretty nasty cold, but now gratefully to be on the mend. As I started editing this episode, it was the same weekend as the international conference. I happened to be an alternate delegate for Area 40 and was able to attend. The reason I bring that up is there was a business motion to rescind conference approval of the pamphlet Writing to Prisoners, and I was hoping to choose something for the reading this week for the new pamphlet, but it has not come out yet. But I did want to give some background on this motion, and I'll be partially reading from the business motion. But basically, the Writing to Prisoners pamphlet was approved by the conference in 2022 when the process of changing bylaws regarding conference-approved literature was just beginning. So any substantive revision of the content of conference-approved literature must receive conference reapproval prior to printing. So basically, with the approved version of Writing to Prisoners, the Prisoner Outreach Committee and the Literature Committee wanted to make some drastic changes to this pamphlet. And so this motion did pass, and the Literature Committee approved version of the new pamphlet supporting incarcerated addicts should be available immediately for the fellowship to utilize and to provide feedback. I have been looking and have not seen it up on the website. So currently up on the website is the service series Writing to Prisoners, of which I have read most of this pamphlet on the podcast before. And so I was really hoping that the new version would be up in time for this episode. But since it isn't, during our conversation, Josef had a little bit of an outburst talking about the chapter of the big book, We Agnostics, which launched a great part of our conversation. And so I did want to choose the reading from We Agnostics, talking about step 2 in finding a higher power. And so I'm going to be reading from pages 45 through 47, and I'll probably skip around a little bit. But the section where I wanted to start is the first new paragraph on page 45, and it says, "Lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find this power? Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And it means, of course, that we are going to talk about God. Here, difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship. But his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God. For we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. We know how he feels. We've shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of him with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. We were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. And from here, I'm going to skip down a little bit. We have found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power, which is God. Much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and to effect a contact with him. As soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed with a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. We found that God does not make too hard terms with those who seek him. To us, the realm of spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. It is open, we believe, to all men. When, therefore, we speak of you to God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies, too, to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to effect first conscious relation with God as we understood him. Afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth, but if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was. So yes, we did talk about we agnostics, and Joseph, I'm sorry that I know you've got some strong feelings on this chapter, but led to a great conversation. And this was the thing that got me past my own conceptions of what God was and enabled me to think of other terms of like an energy source and things that were outside of my preconceived notions of what God was. And so anyway, I did want to read that since I couldn't find the new pamphlet supporting incarcerated addicts. When that does come out, I have a future episode that it should match perfectly with. So hopefully between now and then that will be out. Anyway, before turning it over to the conversation, at the end of this episode, I did have a few songs to play. One song that came up during our conversation about higher power, and I may get to some feedback depending on how much my voice holds up. So now, without further ado, here is my conversation with Joseph. I hope you enjoy it. Yeah, I'm so pleased to have Joseph here on the podcast. Welcome, Joseph.
Hi, Jason. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so I know that I've seen you at the San Francisco meeting, but you did come down to the Los Altos meeting. Was it in the fall or?
It was.
Yeah. So it was really cool to see you at Los Altos. And then I venture up to San Francisco every now and then. I do announcements for intergroup stuff and for the retreat and things like that.
Yeah.
and ran into you there, and it's
Yeah,
like, hey.
it was great being at the Los Altos meeting. I've been in 12-step programs for a long time, and to be honest, meetings sometimes get a little repetitive and
Mhm.
stale. And when they do, I kind of have to remind myself, okay, I'm the addict here. It's my responsibility to shake things up. And when that comes up, it's really helpful to go to a meeting where I don't know anyone, and
Mhm.
it's a great meeting. So it was really fun.
Awesome. Awesome. So the way I usually get started here before getting into your story is going over the various things in your three circles, inner, middle, and outer. Are you comfortable
Yep.
sharing that with us?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Joseph. I'm a sex addict, and my inner circle is any kind of pornography, any sexual content on the internet, compulsive masturbation, which I define as masturbating more than once a week. My middle circle behavior is looking at non-porn imagery for the purpose of getting a sexual hit. It's something that's been kind of an ongoing journey and struggle in my recovery. And then my outer circle is I'm a visual artist. I actually was a working artist for 12 years. I now work in watercolors and pens because it's a little bit easier than having a full-fledged studio.
Mhm.
But so that's a big part of my life and has been for most of my life. And the other kind of outer circle is just engaging with people, which I think this kind of relates to being a sex addict and my recovery. That I heard this to describe alcoholics, but I think it also describes sex addicts. That this is a disease of loneliness,
Mhm. Mhm.
we kind of get into our worst acting out behaviors in isolation, and the opposite part of that, and the thing that actually gives me a great deal of joy, is engaging with people. Engaging with people. Sometimes meetings are a little bit of a slog, but I
Mhm.
love the 10 minutes before the meeting when people kind of check in with each other. I love the 10, 15, 20 minutes after the meeting when people check
Yeah.
in with each other, fellowship. And I like engaging with people outside of meetings and outside of 12-step programs. And I feel like I'm a lot more present to do that.
Awesome. Yeah. So the intent of this podcast when we first started was to be the recording of the 10 to 20 minutes after the meeting, those conversations that we
Yeah.
have out in the parking lot. I remember years and years ago going out for breakfast. Did it a number of times up in San Francisco, but the one time in particular in San Jose after the morning meeting, we went out for breakfast and the conversation just got really heavy and deep. And it was
Interesting.
like, yeah, it was like almost more engaging than the meeting itself.
Yeah. Well,
And
there's a format to meetings, and the format's important,
mhm, mhm.
but there's a whole level of conversation that happens after the meeting and outside of the meetings. And yeah,
Yeah, we have the chance for back and forth, and we don't have the no crosstalk rule and stuff, and so we're able to respond and give any advice if people are open to it and things like that. And we do this after one of my Zoom meetings. We keep the meeting room open for like another hour and a half to discuss whatever is on people's minds. Especially like newcomers come in, and we can ask questions and be there to be able to answer some of those. At the Los Altos meeting last week, we had a couple of people that were brand new, and we usually don't answer questions in the middle of the meeting,
hmm
but the same question kept popping up, and finally someone asked, I don't understand this. And so I was secretarying and I said, normally we do this after the meeting, but I'm going to take a pause here, give you a brief explanation, and then if you have any questions afterwards, come and talk to me. And so, yeah, I like having that ability to have interactions, but like at the meeting itself, it's nice to have a tighter format to keep everything structured and on the level.
yeah. In San Francisco, I go to a Saturday morning meeting at 8:15 at the Unity
Mhm.
Church, and it's a great meeting. And then afterwards, maybe 30 of us go out to breakfast at the Grind at Hayden Scott.
Yeah.
And I got into this conversation with somebody I didn't recognize because that's kind of how I was taught. You don't recognize someone, you introduce yourself to them. And I was talking about, my outer circle, and they looked kind of befuddled and confused. And then I realized they were part of the jogging group that was at the table next to us. So, hey,
Yeah, I had a similar experience. We had the international convention in Oakland, in
Mhm.
2018, and people were staying at the hotel. I'm a huge Tool fan, and so I was wearing a different Tool shirt every day. And there's one guy that came up to me. He's like, "Dude, I noticed you're wearing Tool shirts all the time." So yeah, come over here, give me a hug. And he's just like, he kind of like looked weirded out. He was a guest at the hotel, and not part of our group. And so yeah, I just described, yeah, I played guitar in the talent show the night before. He's like, I had no idea the hotel had a talent show. I'm just like, no, it's a program thing, and
Yeah.
kind of realized afterwards it was a little bit embarrassing, but yeah, it's fun
Hey,
just to be able to talk to strangers about random
we're
shit.
everywhere,
Yeah.
and those of us that make it into SAA meetings are a fraction of 1%. Yeah, so you never know.
Yeah. So in your email, I did read it on the podcast, and it was a brief explanation of your recovery journey and ending up being incarcerated. So I would like to hear your origin story, how you grew up, what got you into the rooms of SAA.
Hmm.
And I believe you mentioned you were also part of another 12-step SA. Yeah.
Hmm.
So yeah, I would love to hear your story.
Great. Well, as I mentioned right before we got on this call, that as a sex addict, I've learned that my motives are always suspect. So my mother lives down in Southern California, right by the beach, and I like getting a morning cup of coffee and going to the beach. And as a sex addict, I kind of have to check my motives, and my motives are that I like having a cup of coffee and checking out the ocean, and there are a bunch of old retired people with their old dogs, and I don't get triggered, and I'm fine with that. If I go to Newport Beach at 1 o'clock and I'm surrounded by young people in bikinis, my motives become very different. And it's part of my
Mm-hmm.
recovery is to kind of check that in. And so I kind of asked myself before getting on this call, what are my motives in doing this podcast? And,
Mm-hmm.
I think the podcast is really important. I really appreciate the work you're doing. I think it helps to bring sex addiction out of the closet
Mm-hmm.
and introduce it because there's a lot of us out there that are not in recovery and that are suffering in isolation. And also, I think I have a story that's helpful to a lot of people. There are a lot of people that have legal problems and are incarcerated as a result of their acting out. And I think my story can be helpful. I'm delighted to do that. And part of my motives are that, I get to be on a podcast and
Mm-hmm.
I feel really important. And so I just want to check that in. And this is where having a sponsor and having a big community in recovery comes in real handy to be able to kind of
Mm-hmm.
check that
Yeah.
in. Yeah, so basically, my story is that in April 2011, I was 18 years sober in AA. I was married, still am, to a wonderful woman. We've been married for about 11 years, been together 13 years. I was a very proud father of a great 6-year-old son. I'd run a successful nonprofit. I had just won some national awards and been on some public TV commercials and stuff like that. And at 5 in the morning in April 2011, there was actually not a knock. It was more like a bang
Yeah.
on the door, and the FBI raided our home. And that's when they do it. They do it early in the morning because that's when you're at your most vulnerable. And I was subsequently indicted for possession of child pornography, which was my deep inner circle behavior. And because I ran kind of a high profile nonprofit and I'd done lots of interviews in newspapers and TVs, which you do to promote your organization, I had lots of high profile funders.
Mm.
It was a very publicized case. My first step was on the nightly news. And in 2012, I was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. I ended up spending 4 years out of a 6-year sentence. And I came home to my wife and my son in 2016 in July. I was on pretrial for about 14 months, which is pretty common. Some people are on pretrial longer or shorter,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I was on pretrial for about 14 months and I did SA meetings. And then when I was incarcerated, I was in federal prison in California and then later in Bastrop, Texas, which is right next to Austin. And I
Yeah.
started going to Sunday morning or Sunday evening, 6 p.m. SAA meetings in the rec yard. congregating is not allowed in prison, even though people do it all the time. And we actually, at one point, had a CO that came up to us, a corrections officer, and said, "What are you doing?" And one of the guys held up an Answers in the Heart book and said, "It's our prayer circle." And I said, "Okay." And of course, it was our prayer circle, you know.
Hmm.
And so, I'm a middle-aged white guy who's reasonably well educated. I spent a few years growing up in Europe. Both my parents are retired university professors. Never expected to end up in federal prison. Anyways, so I came home and it was, my first year out was harder than the 5 years I did in.
Hmm.
And I started going back to SAA meetings. I kind of felt that SAA wasn't a good fit for me. And I was familiar with SAA because of Bastrop. And so I started going to the Saturday morning meeting in San Francisco. And the first people that came up to me, there was a woman named Shelly N.
Oh,
And then
Shelley.
another guy named David J, who's no longer with us. He
Oh,
called Huggy
David.
David because
Yeah.
he hug everyone.
Yeah.
And they both had this thing where because the Saturday morning meeting is a large meeting, if they saw somebody that they didn't recognize or somebody that looked new, they made it a point of going up and introducing themselves
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
them. And I do that just because that's what Shelley and David taught me. And I have to say that everything I've learned about the steps, everything I've learned about recovery, I've learned from other people in the program. I know there's this an idea that maybe you could take the Green Book and climb up into the Himalayan mountains and learn about recovery, but I'm not one of those people. I
Hmm.
need to be
Hmm.
able to go to meetings and talk and listen to other people that are engaged in their recovery. So, I mean, a little bit about my childhood. My parents were divorced when I was 2 years old. I probably had a childhood like a lot of people. There was a lot of mental health stuff in my family,
Hmm.
both with my mother and an uncle who's still struggles with it. Clinical depression is something that runs in my father's side of the family, and I've struggled with it most of my life. And I think that one of the things about recovery is that, there's a saying in AA, more will be revealed.
Hmm.
And they're not kidding, and it kind of opens the door to kind of learn about other things and take care of ourselves. The other thing that happened in an early, I think it was a Sunday morning meeting in San Francisco, there was this woman, because 10 years ago, there were a lot more women
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
meetings. And that's a whole other thing. I love the meetings. I love recovery, but it's the part of SAA in the Bay Area that to be honest, I'm not happy about, which is that when I first came into SAA in 2000 or back into SAA in 2016, there was a core group of women in the rooms, and they were a really important part of the meetings. A
Hmm.
lot of people that were harmed by my acting out behavior were women, and to be able to hear their perspective and hear kind of their stories and their recovery was really important. And then after COVID, uh, they stopped coming. The meetings tend to be very male dominated.
Yeah, the in-person ones. Yeah, I know that some of the women are still on Zoom. There are
Yep,
a couple of people I joined the 8:15 Zoom meeting from
yep,
time
yep.
to time, and it's like, oh wow, I have not seen you in
In
10
ages.
years,
Yep,
and I'm glad to see that they're still part of the program. But
yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah, not in person. And I do have more to say on the women issue. I'll circle back
yeah.
to that. So.
But one of the other things I heard in fall of 2016, I think it was, there was a woman who I think goes by, I don't know if it's
Mhm.
appropriate to call out people's names, but this is how I got sober. I got sober by people talking to me and sharing.
Mhm.
And she said something that because you hear things at meetings and they just burn into your head and they stay with you for the rest of your life. And she said, with the first step, we acknowledge that we're powerless over our addictive sexual behavior, that our lives have become unmanageable. Well, for some of us, that's very obvious.
Mhm.
And she said, with that comes responsibility. And I love that, I'm a sex addict. And with saying that, I take on a responsibility to be proactive about taking care of myself. I'm also struggle with clinical depression. I think I do a
Mhm.
pretty good job in managing that and living with that. And I have a pretty good life, but I'm responsible for taking care of myself. And that's a big part of meetings. I will say this, I genuinely enjoy going to meetings. I really love this community. I love the steps.
Mhm.
And there was a time when I felt that the only way I could work the steps is if I understood them. Um,
Mm.
the understanding happens for me over time,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm an atheist. I've always been an atheist, still an atheist. And I had a person in AA meetings that said, "Oh, I don't really care. Just keep coming back to meetings." And what happened, and this has absolutely happened in SAA, is that I kept coming back to meetings, and over time, gradually, really did come to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me from being batshit crazy. And,
Hmm.
and it happens in the meetings. And at first, my contact was unconscious, and then it became more conscious that I was coming into contact with whatever this higher power that could, restore me to sanity. I was coming into contact with it when I went to meetings.
Yeah, yeah. When I was working steps 2 and 3, I similarly thought that I had to completely understand it. And when I was doing writing, when I was trying to define what my higher power was, I too had been pretty much an atheist. And then by the time I got into program, more agnostic than atheist. In college, definitely atheist, and got into arguments with religious people left and right. By the time I got into program, that had kind of subsided, and I just said I didn't know. But when I was doing my writing for step 2, trying to define what my higher power was, I came to an epiphany that I didn't have to understand it or didn't have to define it in order to move on. And that just kind of freed me. It's like, okay, I've got this belief that something is out there. I don't know what it is. I don't have to over intellectualize it. And I can be okay with that. There's a lot of times I have a hard time being okay with things
Hmm?
that I don't have the final say in. My wife and I will get into arguments, and she will need to cut it off because, it's going to start to get out of hand. And I just want to have my final say, and having to zip it and be okay with it is very difficult for me. So moving on with like step 2 without having an understanding was difficult for me to be okay with that. And but realizing that I didn't need to completely understand what that energy is, I did write down in my step work that I find that connection through nature and through music.
Hmm.
And I first thought of those as my higher power. Now see it, like you had mentioned, this thing kind of evolves.
Hmm.
That those are my connection points to that energy.
Yeah.
And that's what works for me and got me over the hump of steps 2 and 3 and enabled
Right.
me to progress forward.
Yeah. So I've had three sponsors in SAA. One was very brief, but the sponsor that I've been working with for the last, I don't know, year and a half, I chose him because I liked his energy. I liked his personality. He'd been in the program for a long time. He was somebody who showed up for his recovery, which is kind of my criteria when
Hmm.
I look for a sponsor. And he also seemed fairly relaxed and laid back. So early on in our work together, he said, "Well, okay, so and they say the annoying stereotypical things that sponsors say, like, how's your step work going?' and things like
Hmm.
that." But he said, "Okay, for step 2, why don't you read We Agnostics and do a little bit of writing about it, and we'll check in next week." And I said, "Okay, Michael, I'll do that, but I just got to tell you up front, I shit on We Agnostics. I hate that fucking chapter, man. It's like the fucking shitty Jimmy Stewart movie, Hallmark Hall of Fame special. I hate that syrupy shit." And he said, "Okay, that's nice. Well, read We Agnostics, write about it. We'll meet next week." And we did. And we went on to step 3. So,
Nice,
yeah.
nice. Yeah, one of my sponsees, we'd worked with each other on and off before actually going through the steps from the beginning. As he had worked with a few other sponsors. And the way that I was sponsored and continue to sponsor is using the Green Book, the Big Book, and the 12 and 12.
Hmm.
And he was vehemently opposed to AA material. And it's like, I'm not an alcoholic. I don't have a problem with alcohol. Why do we need to use this fucking shit?
Hmm.
And so I'm just like, that's fine. Your assignment still is to read this. We are going to work step 4 through the old AA model of gridding out resentments, fears, harms, and others. And he wanted to do it his way. And I finally said, if you want to work with me, you've asked me to work with you. This is the way we're going to do it.
Hmm.
And like several months later, when we got into steps 8 and 9, he really saw the benefit of working this step 4 out of the AA book and got a better understanding using the 12 and 12, the step work. So I think a lot of stuff in the AA material is archaic and kind of out of touch with modern stuff, but the poetry and the language that Bill W. used is awesome, and it is the foundation of all 12-step recovery. And so I can see the advantage of working on that alongside of the Green Book. So I think the Green Book addresses our issues, but I think the foundation of the step work is found in the AA material.
Hmm.
And yeah, for me as an agnostic, reading We Agnostics was an opening point for me to take into consideration lots of other things and let go of my preconceived notions of what I thought God was. And when I first got into program, all the God steps were a no-go for me.
Hmm.
It's just like, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. And by reading through some of that material, it got me rethinking that it doesn't need to be the way anyone else says it has to be.
Hmm.
It needs to be what works for my recovery.
Yeah. So I had an AA sponsor years ago that said, your relationship to the steps is going to go to a whole other level when you start sponsoring other people.
Mm-hmm.
And all these years later, I found that to be true. So this was actually just 2, 3 weeks ago. I was working with a sponsee who's also atheist and didn't know how to even begin with step 2. And I said one of the things that my first AA sponsor told me that the most important service commitment in the program was greeter, because when
Mm.
people go to their very first meetings, the first human being that they're going to come into contact with is a greeter who will introduce themselves and welcome them to the meeting, and that matters. So, one of those things, you hear these things at meetings and it stays with you. So what I like to do is I like to kind of stand next to the greeter. That way I get some of the benefit of his service commitment,
Mm-hmm.
and like at the Los Altos meeting, there are like 10 people that stand next to the greeter at the beginning of the meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a great way to get to know people and get to know their names. And you'll see people show up to their very first meeting. And when people show up to SAA meetings for the first time, I mean, I didn't come into this program because there was nothing on television. My life was scattered, and people's lives in a variety of different ways have been shredded by their behavior, by their acting out behavior. And you get to welcome them into the program. And then if you show up the next week and hang out with the greeter, or the week after, the week after, the week after, some of these people, some of these newcomers will keep coming back, and you get to see them and you get to see their transformation over the course of even a few weeks and months. And it's an amazing thing to see. If you
Mm-hmm.
really want to see, as a scientific sort of guy, and I like to have things proven to me in cold hard facts, if you want to see that transformation that happens in 12-step programs shown right in front of your face, stand next to the greeter before a meeting. And I'm like, hey, if you want to see a power greater than yourself in action, that's a great way to do it.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. I've been able to look at people that have come into the program over the past couple of years and know where their headspace was when they first got in, and just the tears coming down and the I don't want to talk to y'all. The meeting's over. I'm out of here.
Hmm.
And then see them as they're working on their steps, and someone new comes into the program and they start giving off some great information, and it's like, whoa, something has definitely changed over the past few years, and I can really recognize the change even if they don't see that in themselves. But
Yeah.
yeah,
And
it's
it's easier
amazing.
for me to see in somebody else than to see it in
Yeah,
myself too. So it's
yeah,
kind of a two-way street there.
yeah. I tell the story a lot. It was at the Los Altos meeting. I forget what the actual topic was for the evening, but I remember talking about God. And during the share, I looked down at my shirt, and down the sleeve is the name of an album from this German thrash band called Creator. They have an album called Enemy of God. And so I'm sitting there talking about my relation to my higher power and coming to believe in something. And I choose to call that God and look down at my sleeve. And it's like, wow, how fucking ironic. It's been, a huge turn of events for me. Prior to coming into program, I just had no belief in anything. And then gradually that shifting over the past 20 years.
And now you
Um,
listen to light jazz or, you
I,
know.
I still listen to thrash. I still listen to a lot of the same stuff,
Yeah.
but yeah, that moment, it was just so funny to glance down and look at the sleeve of my arm and see that. It's like, wow, I think things have changed over the past few years. You can see that growth in myself.
Yeah.
So yeah, I did want to circle back on a couple of things. Let's start with the women in program.
Yeah.
This was something that we had as intergroup every May, and the past 2 years it's been in June. We do a brainstorming session of projects and things that we would like to do over the next year. The podcast was one of those projects that came out of the brainstorming, and we call it the visioning meeting. We did have issues that were coming up with retention for women in the program. And we'd have like one woman that would be at a meeting, and then slowly but surely, more women started being attracted to coming and staying at that meeting. But as long as like one woman showed up and then disappeared the next week, and another woman would come into a room full of men, it was very intimidating.
Mhm.
And it was hard. And so what Intergroup did is we had a half day workshop on looking at that. And we ended up opening it up to more inclusiveness within the Bay Area meetings. And so it wasn't just about women, but we did have someone come out, and I keep forgetting the city, where they had more of a 50-50 mix in their meetings. And so we had a nice panel and tried to see what things that they were doing. And the things that we took out of that really increased women's participation in meetings. There was a period of time where, at least the Los Altos meeting, for like a year and a half, we do service rotations every 6 months. So for 3 service rotations, we had a different woman as the secretary of that meeting. So people walking in see the leadership of that meeting being women fronted, and the pandemic hit, and
Yeah.
a lot of that went away. So there are women that I know of that still come from time to time, but they're not there consistently. I did have, after the retreat a few years ago, I did a podcast episode, a panel discussion on women's experiences at the retreat, and that was really, really cool.
Hmm.
And so we have our visioning meeting coming up next month, and yeah, I think it's time that we do like another workshop like that and see what we as a fellowship can do to make things more welcoming, see if there are different things that we do that aren't helpful. A lot of times we don't recognize those things.
Yeah.
And so it would be
No,
really
I think it's
helpful.
vitally important. I think what I've heard from a lot of women that I've talked to is that pre-COVID, because COVID threw a
Hmm.
lot of wrench into a lot of things, but that when a woman would come to a meeting, there was a pretty good understanding that there were probably going to be at least 3 or 4 other core
Hmm.
women in that meeting, and that support of knowing that there were going to be other women at that meeting was the thing. And then after COVID, when the meeting started opening up in person again, and you'd have a woman show up and they'd be the only woman in the meeting, and that happened more than once, they'd end up
Hmm.
drifting off. And so,
Yeah, I'm going to probably offer that up as a brainstorming idea if no one else does. But I think we've talked about it at Intergroup over the past year. And, I would like to see something like that move forward.
yeah.
Another project that we have been working on, and the person that was kind of spearheading it, I think he moved out of the Bay Area, but talking about the incarcerated. So we
Hmm.
do a lot of work with San Quentin
Yep.
Federal Prison, which is right in here in our
San
back.
Quentin State, right?
Is it state?
I believe so.
Okay. Okay. So
And they're
yeah.
actually of all the prison, because I do a lot of work
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
reentry population. I actually do that. That's my day job now. I'm a career advisor helping people that are coming out of prison get back into the workforce, which has been part of my journey.
Hmm.
And certainly my work in recovery kind of leads to things outside of my 12-step life. But yeah, San Quentin is known probably nationally as being one of the places that has a lot of resources for the
Yeah.
population in there.
Yeah, so what we have run up against and what we have been trying to do over the past year, and I think this is going to come up at our visioning meeting again, is looking to get an SAA meeting in San Quentin run by people here in the Bay Area. So a
Hmm.
lot of times the people that are incarcerated will start a 12-step meeting in the prison, but they have no experience running a meeting,
Hmm.
or have a full understanding of the material.
Hmm.
And so we are looking for experienced people in the Bay Area to go into San Quentin and to be able to start meetings. There is a lot of red tape.
Yeah.
So people that sponsor incarcerated in San Quentin cannot be part of the meetings.
Hmm.
And so we
Well,
have a
there's
lot of,
also issues of safety that comes
yeah.
up.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff. We found that there was another outside group that claimed the name SAA. They were a recovery group that did multiple things, but they said that their meeting was an SAA meeting and also had affiliation with this 12 step, this recovery center. And so it was not sanctioned by SAA.
Yeah.
And so we have been doing what we can to halt that to
Yeah.
to the best of our ability. And so there's a lot of stuff going on, and we do work with the ISO
Hmm.
and the Prisoner Outreach Committee, the POC. One of the things that is coming up at the conference in a couple of weeks is looking to decertify the Writing to Prisoners pamphlet
Hmm.
because they have a new revised pamphlet. I can't remember what the full title is, but they've updated the language and how the ISO and prisons operate.
Hmm.
And so the way currently the literature committee and the conference are set up makes it really hard to change the material once it's been approved as conference
Right,
approved.
right.
And
It,
so
yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting. So when I came home in 2016, I think it was in 2017, my sponsor at the time nudged me to get a service commitment, and so I got a literature commitment at the Sunday meeting, and I got the purple Writing to Prisoners pamphlet, and I did
Hmm.
not like it.
Hmm.
I felt like it didn't really address the fact that sex addicts and sex offenders in prison have like former police officers, and they have a mark. Federal prisons tends to be pretty safe, but you do want to be cognizant that when you're writing to people that are sex offenders in prison, they have safety issues and concerns that are very real. The staff
Hmm.
will read the incoming mail and then share it with affiliated shot callers and gang members and say, okay, this person's a sex offender, this person's a sex offender, and they can be threatened. And so I didn't like that first pamphlet. But you have to choose your battles, and I had my own stuff
Hmm.
to deal with. And then it was maybe a couple years later, I was literature person on another meeting, and I noticed that they had changed the pamphlet. And it
Hmm.
was a helpful lesson to me that SAA is still a young program,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of movement and a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of sex addicts that are coming out of prison and are doing service work all over the place. And clearly, other people had been having this conversation and they adjusted it, and the work is still continuing. And I think it's really important. I don't know if I mentioned this during the recording, but when I was going to SAA meetings in federal prison, it
Hmm.
was in Bastrop, Texas. So, like I said, very low security. The white supremacists called it Camp Snoopy.
Hmm.
And it was a closed yard, which means that at every 50 minutes, they'd say yard move, and you'd have 10 minutes to get from point A to point B. And I'd take my answers in the heart, and I'd go to the rec yard and meet a core group of people. So, whenever I read Answers in the Heart, I think about being surrounded by barbed wire fences. And
Hmm.
I was locked up with people in Texas that, the Texas judges hand out 10-gallon sentences that were literally serving 18, 20-year sentences for looking at pictures on the internet. So sex addicts whose lives had really, they were dealing with huge consequences, people
Hmm.
that were
Hmm.
going to die in prison, that were showing up to the Sunday SAA meeting and working their program as if their life depended on it was, took on a whole other meaning. And I also went to AA meetings. What was interesting about the AA meetings is somebody that has been a part of that for a long time is that when I went to the AA meetings in Lompoc, in Southern
Hmm.
California, the staff weren't in the room. So the guy that actually ran it was a shot caller for the white supremacist. My wife is Jewish. My kid's been bar mitzvahed. I've got opinions here, but
Hmm.
he was born again AA. He was at the beginning of what it was a pretty long sentence, and his name was Creeper. And we were never pals because obviously I'm not affiliated or anything like that. But he said, look around the compound here, 1,400 guys, two-thirds of these guys are going to come back on a second charge. And that's a fact. That's
Hmm.
that's that's not an opinion. And he said the only chance any of these guys have to not come back is if they're able and willing to take an honest look at changing their behavior, which is what the 12 steps are really about. It's
Yeah,
about a
yeah.
willingness to change our behavior, to recognize that I have behaviors that are creating huge problems in my life. And there's a simple program in these 12 steps that help me to look at my behavior, look at my thinking around my behavior, and make adjustments and change. And then I went to Texas and they had staff in the AA meetings and it stopped being a 12-step program. But yeah, I think that stuff's really important and important work. I don't do it myself because it's just too triggering for me. And my wife actually works with she does a lot of reentry advocacy work, specifically
Yeah.
with women. And, there's an old saying that when you lock a man up for several years, if he has a female partner, they become a single parent, and you kind of incarcerate the whole family. And so she's become a big advocate there, and she'll go into prisons, and she says it's very triggering to her as well.
Yeah.
But important work.
Yeah, definitely. We coordinate with Southern California. So we've got
Hmm.
a California prisoner outreach group. So we've got a couple guys down in Southern California that are taking care of that end. And then up here in Northern California, we mostly deal with San Quentin, but there are a few others out in the Central Valley that we deal with as well. So yeah, we try to do whatever we can. I know that we have a number of people that sponsor people in
Yep.
prison, and
Yep.
that is hugely important. And the ISO is still looking for people to sign up for that service. Is often they'll have a backlog of 200 people looking for sponsors.
Yeah.
And it's very different. One of my sponsees who I've had here on the podcast a couple of times had a very similar situation to you. And so he just started his 5 years in November. And he had been in county jail, transferred to county jail. And then right now he is currently switching from county to federal prison. And I'm still waiting to get his details so we can continue our sponsorship work.
Hmm.
We ended up working at the beginning of step 9 and working on step 10. And so I've got stuff ready for him, but I've had nowhere to mail stuff because he's been bouncing
He's in
from
transit
place.
right now.
Yeah, so eventually I will be sponsoring someone in prison, and
That's great.
yeah,
So yesterday I went to the San Francisco Tuesday night meeting and their first step presentations, and there was a guy, a good friend of mine, whose story is very similar to mine. He's probably been on this podcast, a guy named Jerry.
yeah, Jerry. Hmm.
He was doing his second first step presentation, and the story is that when I was coming home from prison in 2016, first of all, hashtag Me Too was
Hmm.
blowing up, and it seemed like every week you were hearing about this other high profile person whose life was blowing up around their sex addiction. And I was like, boy, there are a lot of who knew there was so many sex addicts out there, you know.
Hmm.
And then right as I was coming home, and kind of back home with my wife and my son and dealing with a bad probation officer. I met Jerry, and he was on pretrial getting ready to go in. And when I came home, I'd been in AA for 18 years. When I was arrested, I had, had a home group. I had, I'd had members of that community that were at my wedding, that were in my house, that knew my wife, knew my kid. And I did not feel welcomed back to that community when I came home.
Mm.
And I had this pathological fear of telling my story at SAA meetings. I'm like, okay, I
Yeah.
realize that other people are doing their first step presentations and doing, and sharing. But if I do it, I'm going to be treated like a pariah. And I know what I'm talking about. And then I went to the Tuesday meeting when it was at Kaiser in San Francisco, and Jerry did his first step presentation, and his sponsor, who is still his sponsor and was sponsoring him when he was in prison.
Hmm.
So he did his first step presentation, and it was, it's always valuable to see somebody else do their work. And there's an involvement in recovery that, like, you just get involved in your recovery at a whole other level when you do a first step presentation. But the other really powerful thing about that in early 2017 is watching this large meeting just have his back and support him.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I was like, I can do this. I can tell my story. I can do my first step presentation, and I'm going to be supported. And I have. I've always been supported.
Hmm.
And so, I always tell people that when you do a first step presentation, first of all, you're doing a great service to yourself because you're actually doing the fucking work.
Yeah.
But you never know who you're going to impact. You never know that quiet person in the back of the room that shows up late and leaves early. And, you never know who you're going to impact and how you're going to impact them. So I did my second first step presentation in Oakland about a year ago. And I talk about my criminal charges and all of that in my journey. And there were a bunch of people there that I didn't know.
Hmm.
And because, people in Oakland, they might as well be in Utah. It's like the other side of the bridge. And there were like 5 other people there that had criminal backgrounds or were on pretrial or had come out of prison or, had legal troubles that suddenly raised their hand and started sharing. And that's one of the things I feel like, oh, hey, if I can be of service to somebody else that's on that journey. And the other funny thing about my relationship with Jerry is that, I felt like I was able to be of service to Jerry by saying, this is what you can expect. Now, he ended up going to Lompoc, where I had spent 20 months.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I felt like I was able to kind of be helpful and say, hey, this is what it's going to be like, and blah, blah, blah. What I didn't understand is that by being able to be helpful and have a friendship with Jerry, it kind of saved me in that first year home.
Hmm.
I mean, it saved me in a way that I didn't realize until years later, that it's a big part of the service work I try to do. When you come through that experience and say, I lost 5 years of my life. I lost 5 years where my son grew up without a father. I lost my career. I lost my standing. What the fuck do I do with this experience? And what I realized very gradually and over time is that I'm a survivor. And a funny thing about being a survivor is when you're a survivor, you start seeing it in other people. I go to SAA meetings and I see survivors left and right.
Hmm.
I leave the meeting and I go out on the street and I see survivors. And it's a very powerful thing to be able to see. And it's something I wouldn't probably be able to see if I hadn't gone through that experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a similar experience with my first step. Child pornography is what got me into the rooms of SAA. I was fortunate not to be part of the legal system. So
Wow.
my wife caught me and got me into my first meeting, and that was enough. But sharing that, writing about it, and when it came time, right now I've got a bottle of water because I'm having some coughing, but I had a bottle of water with me when I was doing my first step. And when it came time for those next couple of paragraphs that I was going to have to read in front of the group, it was like, okay, here's my water, here's my sip, and here I go. And on the other end, I received a lot of love. And anytime that I've been a speaker at meetings, I always include that information because you never know who is at the meeting and has felt hesitant to speak up about that type of behavior.
Hmm.
And looking at the podcast, I was a speaker at the Saturday morning San Jose meeting in 2019. and I recorded that for the podcast. I recorded my second first step presentation. There were too many details in that one that I did not want out in the public.
Hmm.
As if I was a one-time guest on the podcast, it would be okay. But being that I'm on the podcast week after week after week, and my
Hmm.
family does tune in from time to time,
Absolutely.
I usually give them the episodes that are more about the recovery and music rather than the deep, dark,
Mhm.
heavy stuff. But it was important for me to talk about that stuff, have it recorded and posted on episode 3 to set a precedent that this stuff is okay to talk about on the podcast. And a lot of times people want to just keep the details very beige,
Hmm.
and it's like, if that works for you, that's fine, but I want this to be a safe space where we can talk about this sort of stuff
Yeah.
and get it out to the public. And I know that our Los Altos meeting is a closed meeting, and occasionally we have had the occasion where it was actually at a different meeting. We had people supporting someone show up at the meeting, and we didn't find out until much later during the meeting. And so once we did find out that these people weren't addicts and that they were there for support, the level of shares became very vague.
Hmm.
People were not comfortable
Yeah.
sharing the details. And so I wanted to make sure, at least for this podcast, that we are a safe place to share the heavy details. And I do have editing capabilities. So I have
Hmm.
pulled certain sections of people's stories. I've pulled a couple of episodes due to the request of the guest and things
Sure.
like that. But this is a place where we're here to be able to talk about that stuff, and in doing so, the minor attracted people's stories, the maps, my sponsee Rye, his episodes, people listen to that, and that's what got them into recovery. That's what
Mhm.
got them to open up about that sort of stuff. It's still hard to talk about at a general meeting, and there are meetings that are set up. The Fellow Travelers Intergroup is set up meetings that are specifically for minor attracted people to talk about those legal issues.
Hmm. I
But
have, I mean, it's incredibly important. There's an old AA saying, "We're only as sick as our secrets," but
mhm,
there is a stigma around this stuff. So I had a kind of an interesting conversation with my wife. I'm still married. A recent candidate for California governor was caught up
mhm,
in a sex assault scandal.
mhm,
So, anyways, my wife was like, first of all, these fucking men in power
mhm,
engaging in this behavior that is hurting people. That is, this guy has hurt people, a lot of people. And he's part of a whole population of men in power that just feel that they're immune to that. And if this guy would step foot in a fucking SAA meeting, would you support him? And I had to kind of take a breath. Obviously, this is a woman I've been with for 27 years, and she's been by my side,
mhm,
including during the 5 years that I was locked up. It was a real question, and it deserved a thoughtful answer. And the answer was yes, I would, because I've been supported.
mhm,
And this is where SAA meetings are a sacred place. They're a place where people can, it's a community, a safe community where people can come and look at the behavior that's hurting our lives, destroying our lives, and hurting other people's
mhm,
lives, and get help to not engage in that behavior anymore. And I was welcomed into this program with open arms. And so, meetings are a sacred place, and I think of it that way. I'll also say, just in terms of step work, my son was 6 years old when the FBI knocked on the door in 2011.
mhm.
Last weekend, my wife and I went to the East Coast and congratulated him on graduating from college. I have a
Wow.
good relationship with my son. I'm still married. I have a good relationship with my wife, and I have my family and my community. I do work that's really meaningful to me. I have a great community in SAA, and I suspect that the steps and this community have something to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's and I love these. I love and I also make fun of these cliched. This is the part of the podcast where you bring on the Hallmark Hall of Fame soundtrack. But there's the old saying, "Don't leave before the miracle happens." You see people coming into SAA meetings as newcomers, and their lives are just shattered. And there is an amazing thing that happens in recovery. And I've come to, I believe it. I believe it because I've seen it with my own eyes, and I've lived it. And yeah.
Awesome. So we have been recording for an hour.
All right.
Is there anything else that you would like to add before we close this out?
I think just as I said before the recording, thank you for the work that you're doing. It's important. And I think that I guess I'm going to just state the obvious that when a sex addict comes into a meeting, it's not just the sex addicts whose life has been ripped apart. It's also everyone else in their community, their families, their kids. And I think being able to bring this out of the closet, to get it to a point where we can talk about it as a society, even outside of SAA meetings, is incredibly important. We're not there yet, but this is the important groundbreaking work to doing that. So thank you for the work you're doing, Jason.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And yeah, it is kind of the mission statement of the podcast is to help break the stigma, myths, and misconceptions of sex addiction. So this is one of the intents that I had for putting something like this out into the world, and I am grateful to keep doing it. Sometimes it becomes really difficult, but the rewards is so amazing. When I get emails from people or I meet someone at a meeting, and this has happened multiple times, people's first meetings, they walk in and they hear my voice and it's like, oh shit, you're the guy from the podcast. Thank you for putting that out. And that's what got me into the rooms. And yeah, I love hearing stories like that. So it makes it all worthwhile.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm so grateful that we got to do this.
Likewise.
Yeah. Thank you for sending out that email, and glad that you gave me a little bit of grace in terms of getting this scheduled, as I know that email was quite a few months ago.
Yeah. Well, it's on my to-do list to get out to the Los Altos meeting. So when I was at that Los Altos meeting, there was a guy that raised his hand and shared about legal struggles that he was having. And he got a very short sentence. And I just heard from him on Sunday, and he's out. So, life has a way of spinning forward. But that Los Altos meeting actually made a very important kind of friendship and connection. So it's on my to-do list to get out there again.
Awesome. Yep. And I'm planning on having him on a future episode of the podcast. We talked last week. I was surprised to see him at a meeting, and we talked afterwards, and he's ready to share his story. So awesome. Yeah. All right.
Amazing thing to see.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
All right. See you.
All right. Bye.
Many thanks to Joseph. I had such a fun time with this conversation, and I really hope to see him at the Los Altos meeting. If not then, I'll probably see him up at the San Francisco meeting again. But yeah, I had such a great time. I will be leaving some links in the show notes for things that we touched upon in our conversation. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the pamphlet Writing to Prisoners, it is now titled Service Series Writing to Prisoners, Recovery Through Outreach in SAA, and there will be a new pamphlet called Supporting Incarcerated Sex Addicts. So if I find the link to the new pamphlet, I will put that in the show notes as well. I will also be leaving a link to the main SAA-recovery.org website and their section on prisoner outreach. Additionally, I wanted to mention that I chose to bleep one of the names that Josef N mentioned. She does have a unique name, and in contrast with the other names, I decided to bleep that one. That was when we were talking about women in the program, and I will be leaving links to the Women's Intergroup website, as well as the page on the main SAA website for women. And afterwards, I remembered the name of the city that I was talking about earlier with the workshop that I had mentioned. It was Tucson, Arizona. So we flew someone out from Tucson and had a great workshop that day. So I think that is all that I wanted to mention for the links that I'll be providing in the show notes. Also mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I will be able to get to some feedback as well as playing a few songs. We got one comment on Spotify, a few on YouTube, and one email that I'm going to read. So the first, coming from Spotify, is on episode 3, which is my story. And it says, "Thanks for your share. I can relate deeply with it. I've only found the podcast lately, but I've been in recovery for about a year in one of the other fellowships. And you're very welcome." I did reference this episode in my conversation with Joseph when talking about getting my story out early on in the podcast and talking about the depths of my addiction, getting into child pornography and bestiality online. Just wanting to let people know that this is a place where we will be talking about things like that. So thanks again for the comment. Moving on to YouTube on episode 4, the 3 circles, a tool of recovery. We got 2 comments, both from the same person. And the first says, "Thank you for this. I've been formulating my circles and this has helped a lot." And the second one says, "The non-compulsive food eating was something mentioned that I've added to my outer circles." Awesome. And again, episode 4, I was really wanting to get the concepts of the 3 circles out there at the beginning of the podcast, so people that were not in program could get a basic understanding of what we talk about when we mention inner, middle, and outer circle, because we do reference it a lot on the rest of the episodes and in meetings. And it's such a helpful tool that we use in our program. So thanks for that. From there, I did want to move on to email. And we had just one that I wanted to read here. And it says, "Hi, Jason. I just started listening to your podcast and I'm only on episode 6. I've been talking to a counselor for about a month now, and she suggested that I could be a sex addict. After listening to your podcast, I know that I am. I was physically molested as a child and groomed by a parish priest. What started off as pornography, masturbating, women, and men has been there all my life. I always knew that I wasn't normal, but I didn't know how to deal with it. I've been married 38 years and I'm now 59. I don't want to be that person anymore. I'm writing into you to learn how to get into the SAA program. I'm a truck driver and I live in Massachusetts. Because of my work schedule, all the local meetings are in the afternoon or at night when I'm working. Any suggestions or help would be greatly appreciated. If anything, I plan on listening to all of your podcasts, now knowing that I'm not alone in this. Thank you." Signed, A. And thank you so much for this email. And I'm really sorry to hear about the abuse you suffered when you were a child. But yes, welcome home. You always have a place here in SAA. So getting to your question, since local meetings are out of the way in your area, there are several Zoom meetings that happen throughout the day. I know of a lot of friends who are truck drivers in the program, and they've had the ability to Zoom into meetings. Just yesterday, I had emailed someone a list of daily Zoom meetings, and on the podcast, we talk about the noon Zoom meeting, which is actually called the Men's and Non-Binary Zoom meeting, named for each day of the week. There is also the Houston noon Zoom meeting, which happens 2 hours before that one. A few hours after the noon Zoom meeting that I talk about is the Miami Zoom meeting. And then later there is the SAA West Side meeting. And I will be emailing all of these meetings to you. And I know that there are a few others, but these are kind of ones that fit various times during the day for me. And if I miss one, I can always hop on one of the other ones. And additionally, a lot of my friends who are truck drivers do listen to the podcast in between meetings. And a lot of people that are unable to get to meetings often listen to the podcast as well. So it's a useful tool for a lot of us. Welcome to the world of SAA, and reach out to me if you have any questions. So that will conclude all of the feedback that I have for this week. From there, I'm going to move on to playing a few pieces of music. 3 of them are metal songs, and I did want to balance it with a little bit of folk blues at the end, so it's not all going to be heavy stuff. But in my conversation with Joseph, I did talk about the German thrash band Creator and their song Enemy of God. And I had the long sleeve shirt with Enemy of God written down the length of the arm. And while I was talking in a meeting, just realizing how far I've come since entering the program of SAA, being an atheist agnostic, and then moving towards a sense of spirituality and finding a higher power that I connect to through music and nature. So anyway, I did want to play this song, Enemy of God, and because it's fast and loud, I did want to read some of the lyrics. All nations hail the end of peace, new dawn inception of disease, age of revenge has now been born by the mother of all wars. Enemy of God, purity and innocence is killed. Enemy of God, peace died long ago when life stood still. So here is that song that I was referencing, Enemy of God by Creator. I love Creator, and I've seen them so many times. Always awesome. But moving from that, I wanted to reflect, even in the metal genre, finding God. I've talked about this on episode 9. The band Soulfly, the singer Max Cavalera, was in the Brazilian thrash band Sepultura. Very angry and aggressive music. And after he left Sepultura, he founded the band Soulfly. On episode 9, I talked about their song, I Believe. It was just so interesting for me hearing him, knowing where his past had been, coming to believe in God. And I wanted to move on to 2 songs by Soulfly. The first is called Inner Spirit. And I did talk about my spiritual playlists on episode 129 of the podcast. One of the mixed CDs that I made was titled after this song called Inner Spirit. One of the things I love about Soulfly is taking just heavy music and also incorporating mellow vibes. So the 2 songs that I'm going to be playing have a bit of heaviness and a bit of groove. And so the song Inner Spirit, some of the lyrics that I wanted to read: soldier of God, like it was before, 2,000 years the lion roar. The next line has never been written down, but it sounds like innocent I. And then moving on says, can you feel the final Armageddon is near? Can you feel the ancient prophecy ago reveal? Inner spirit, inner spirit, inner spirit. And so here is Soulfly with the song Inner Spirit. Because the interlude jam was so long, I wanted to make a quick edit for the Inner Spirit part. That's a really, really cool jam. So a lot of their songs kind of mix in a reggae feel, but yeah, love that. The other Soulfly song that I wanted to play is called Fly High. And so again, I wanted to read out the lyrics. Pressure building on my soul, I ask God to take control. Give me guidance in this world. Conquer this fear spiritually. Forever let it be into infinity. Just let my soul fly free, and let me be the one God wants me to be. Just let my soul fly free, and let me see everything I'm supposed to see. Just let my soul fly free. Here is Soulfly with a song called Fly High.
Pressure building on my soul. I ask God to take control. Give me guidance in this world. Conquer this fear spiritually. Forever let it be into infinity. Just let my soul fly free. And let me be the one that wants me to be. Just let my soul fly free. And let me see everything I'm supposed to see. Just let my soul fly free. And let me be the one that wants me to be. Just let my soul fly free. And let me see everything I'm supposed to see. Just let my soul fly. Just let my soul fly. Just let my soul fly free. Just let my soul fly. Just let my soul fly. Just let my soul fly free.
Love it. When these albums were coming out, that was right when I got into program and trying to build a connection with my higher power. And recently I've been on such a Soulfly kick, so love these songs. So like I mentioned, I didn't want all of the music on this episode to be completely heavy, so I wanted to go out with a little bit something lighter. An artist that I've played here on the podcast before, Eric Bibb. This song, I Heard the Angels Singing, is such an incredible song. And again, for me to go from Enemy of God to I Heard the Angels Singing is so awesome. My wife found this song and we just both fell in love with it. Anyway, here is Eric Bibb with the song I Heard the Angels Singing.
You know, I went down in the valley one day. I heard the angels sing. I seen an old devil, I walked down my way. Whoa! But I heard the angels say, get back, Satan, and get out of my way. I hear my angels, come on, clap your hands. I don't want to hear another word you say. Whoa! Come on, Deacon Brown. Singing in that great getting the morning. Whoa, don't you know I heard my angel? Oh, hallelujah.
So love the song. The end of this, when he just goes off, it's just so awesome. So I think on the music playlist that I've created on Apple and Spotify, I don't have this exact live version, but there are a few really good versions out there of the song, and just it lifts my heart. So with that, I'm going to close out this episode. If you did have any feedback for the podcast on any specific episodes, or if you have any music that is part of your recovery that you would love to share here on the podcast, you can reach us at feedback@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. And if you wanted to get a hold of me personally, ask any questions about the program or the podcast, you can reach me at jason@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. I have been overwhelmed in booking new recordings. So I've got a few already done and 3 or 4 that are currently being scheduled. So look forward to those episodes. I thank you so much for tuning into this one. And as always, keep coming back. The views and opinions contained in the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Bay Area Intergroup or the ISO of SAA.